All right. Well, we should get started with Microsoft Teams governance. Thank you all for coming. I know that Tom's speaking right now in another room, so it's a hard pull to get butts in seats when he's presenting. So I'll do my best. Let's see. Oh, well, that is not going to do it. I may have to use my arrows. Hang on a second. Okay, let's review and start. New. All right, there we go. So a big thanks to all of the sponsors, Platinum, Gold, and Silver, who have made this conference possible. This has been one of the best conferences I've attended in a while for the meatiness of the subject matter expertise and the content that's being provided. And I like the diversity of information that's being provided across different tech stacks. So big hands to our sponsors and the organizers and the volunteers who have made this all happen. We'll start off today with a general introduction. We'll go into 6 key components of Teams compliance, but you'll see there's kind of an interchangeable piece there. And then we'll talk about where the management areas are for Teams compliance. And I'm seeing I probably should have used the word governance there since that's my title. Teams governance. So I'd like to do maybe a quick show of hands. Is anybody familiar with Teams governance or Teams compliance? Okay, everybody almost. That's awesome. I want you to keep me honest. Yes. Well, and my expertise is from within the Microsoft 365 stack, but I know that as a unified communications conference, there are a lot of other aspects to consider, and maybe Teams isn't even the only communication solution that an organization or an enterprise might have in play. So I'm looking to you unified communications experts to pipe in throughout the deck and keep me honest and also help enlighten me where there are some connection points or information that I can connect to the Teams and Microsoft stack. I'm Kristi Robison. My company is Paint Rock Consulting. I do strategic advisory, Chief Information, Chief Strategy Officer, and lots of information governance and compliance consulting.
Where do you live?
I live in north central Wyoming in a really small town. I'm 120 miles due east of Cody. Hyattville? You know where? Awesome, okay. It's a real small town. They moved to the place that I wanted to vacation to, and they just so happened to have a regional Homeland Security regional fiber optic trunk line. So unlike most small towns, it has blazing fast networks. So on our orientation, we'll be talking about governance and compliance in Teams, but what I'm not going to do is regurgitate some of the things and the graphics and the deliverables that you might already have seen from Microsoft Docs or from learn.microsoft.com. Hopefully I'm providing you with a little bit more information. And again, the unified communications folks, please engage throughout. Okay. So we'll start off with a shared responsibility model. Microsoft Teams is part of a Microsoft cloud, and as such, there's a shared responsibility model on maintaining the infrastructure, the operation ability, the reliability, the uptime on your cloud environment, depending on perhaps what type of cloud you might have. But the communications software is what Teams is considered. It's considered a business productivity app and communication software, and because of that, it's considered a SaaS, or software as a service. And in that chart, you can tell that the larger burden of responsibility for maintenance is on the Microsoft side of the fence, whereas a client or a user company utilizing Teams would have responsibility over the content that they create, that information and data, how they manage security around that data, and how they manage devices and how that data is accessed by its employees or users. This next slide, I've got the key components of Microsoft Teams governance, but can anybody tell me why they think I might have put the brackets around Microsoft Teams?
Governance is governance.
That's it. Governance is kind of a broad term. Well, it is a really broad term. And it's one of those things that isn't often well defined. There's a problem that requires somebody to define it, to shape it. These are 6 general pillars around governance, and we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail in terms of how they relate to Microsoft Teams. But essentially, having your governance policy or an information governance or information management policy is a starting point for an organization. That really, in my opinion, is it lays down the ground rules for how that business is going to operate. Not just what business they do, but whatever industry they're in, whatever services or products that they're providing, there are going to be rules of the road. Whether that's registering your business with the states that you operate in, or paying taxes, there's a whole gamut of rules of engagement that have to be adhered to when a business is in operation, and extending that or documenting those and then extending those to your content and your environment is a great starting place if companies don't already have an information or a governance plan. And then the other steps of that come about over time. As a small company grows, they're going to be forced to have to manage access and users and put some controls around security. As a company continues to grow, more people create more data, and that data needs some protection and some compliance. Monitoring and reporting, that can refer to your business operations as a whole in terms of generic governance, but in Teams that can include monitoring and reporting activities, users, devices, and provide some insights where you might be able to do things or enhance things administratively to make your environment better for your users. Incident management and response, and some people think that might not necessarily fit with Teams governance. I kept it in because it is a governance principle, and if you're working within an organization and people suddenly can't use Teams, or chat's not working, or the video is no longer available, your IT organization is going to really hear about that. So including that part of how you manage Teams into your incident response systems is very important. It's one more of the technical tools that your company is utilizing. And then the last piece is one that I apologize to my red-headed friend here, but it's often kind of the red-headed stepchild of governance, and that's the training and communication piece. A lot of times that just kind of becomes a can that gets kicked down the road. Oh, it's going to be intuitive. We'll build it in on the back end. It'll be automatic. There's still value in training your workforce and your employees on governance and compliance, even if it is just to explain what the rules of the road are. We're a service organization, so we don't charge tax in these states and we do in these states, or whatever the requirements are for your business to operate.
So as an example of that, we have recording turned off because our policy is that we're not allowed to record client conversations. And so we have a form that we can go through and we can fill out to get an exception to that rule, but we can only record for training purposes. Well, if you go into Teams and you haven't been through that training, you're going to make it a help desk ticket that the recording is turned off, but it's off for a reason.
That's a great point. You're not the first company I've heard that does that. Do you? It's interesting how freely record is utilized. But something to consider, bouncing back to that data protection, is as your company grows over time and your users create and generate more and more data, That grows your data estate, your information footprint, and not all of that information is going to be valuable all the time. Yep, there is a time information, a value of information over time. It's a declining curve. So let's say I get an email from you about, oh, we need to plan a place to have lunch tomorrow, celebrate the conference, choose these 5 places. That email is going to be very relevant and important for me for about 2 days. But I don't need to keep it in my email for 3 years. You know what I mean? There are a lot of discretionary or transitory type information and communications that happen that don't necessarily need to stick around forever. So having that defined as or before you roll out, new technology or Teams or other tools, especially like Teams that encourage more and more, communication and creation, having those things mapped out is a good thing. You can do it after the fact. It's just, this is an analogy I like to call trying to push toothpaste back into the tube. I worked with an organization once that had 40 employees. They did no, announcement or training before they just turned on and enabled teams to see what would happen. Kind of that organic growth and monitoring. And at the end of 2 weeks, they had over 400 team sites. So, yeah. Well, and the issue, it's so easy to click that button, but if you don't have a workflow or process behind that, then you're going to have to clean things up eventually, and nobody wants to hear that their, Words with Friends team is going to be deleted. So it's easier to define it at the beginning than trying to push that toothpaste back into the tube. So these next components, I'll just go through them largely one at a time. A governance framework is, think of that as like the scaffolding for a building. When you're building a building, not even the scaffolding, but the 2x4, right? The infrastructure, the walls. When you're building a building, it's got to have a good solid foundation, and that foundation or framework needs to be able to stand the test of time. And having a good governance framework is important to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to define things at a granular level to develop a framework, just enough to get some of those bigger picture requirements and rules defined. Then you can further fine-tune those into teams or whatever your platform is, governance policies. So defining how users, what your adoption should look like. How do you want to manage that? Do you want to do it all at once or roll it out in waves, or do it a team at a time? Do you want to have provisioning defined and set up and workflowed? Defining retention and archiving policies. So one of the things that people do, I think, when they think about retention and retention labels, they think immediately, that means I'm having to keep stuff for a really long time. The other side of that people don't understand or don't often think about is that also means you have a defensible disposition. Stuff that you're not supposed to keep more than 7 years, why do it? It's got no more business value, may not have any regulatory compliance value after whatever the retention period is, and it's taking up data space in your environment. So make sure, besides just a retention for the things that you need to keep for a period of time, make sure that you also have some disposition tuned in and turned on as well. Right. Any questions? You guys have been pretty quiet.
Do you want to talk specifically about disposition of conversations and the governance around, the timing of, because I have a little message that pops up and it says previous conversations have been deleted as per policy.
Oh, that's a good idea. So a couple of companies that I've worked with, they've got a really interesting approach to how they're managing Teams' life cycle. They are considering Teams as kind of the right now, in the now, current activity related to whatever it is, whether it's your line of business or your functional group, or maybe you're on a project team. But Teams, for some companies, they define it as a transitory thing. and apply a 3-year, for example, 3-year transitory disposition on that. So part of that includes training, but the employees or the personnel who are working in those teams, they'll be notified when they create a team that this has a 3-year lifespan. It can be extended in some cases, but that the expectation is that what happens in teams is very on the fly, kind of a replacement for internal emails. You know, you can get a lot quicker action in chat than you can by sending an email and attachments. And having that timeline defined is really well. It requires or it forces, for example, project teams who might be delivering a new product line with new specs and requirements documents. Those things then are brought into the organization, maybe the marketing team or the product manufacturing team into their SharePoint sites, for example, and retained as business information in those environments. But while they're being perhaps cross-functionally, actively collaborated on, perhaps even internal and externally, they live within this semi-temporary team space. That may not be the best case for everybody, but it seems to work well to prevent some excessive team sprawl. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Yeah, okay, let me, okay, so the question was about archiving a team or channel. Yes, archiving is available. I haven't actually implemented that on a team yet. I don't think, I'd have to think back. The general answer is yes. I'm trying to think back through the clicks that would take me to the archive step, and I can't recall them top of mind. But yes, let me come back to that. All right, so people, access, and permissions. A lot of people who are using Teams or thinking about using Teams, they're not going to just go download Teams and run it on their enterprise servers. It's a cloud-based app, and it's part of a family of a Microsoft suite of services. And so as such, you're probably, if you're rolling that out, you probably already have existing security and role-based access controls defined, maybe even conditional access controls. These are things that you would want to extend logically to your team's environment as well. One of the reasons why, going back to that toothpaste in a tube scenario, is when a new team is created, there's a lot of technical assets that get spun up on the back end. So there's an Outlook calendar, there's a planner board, there's the document library. If you've got templates defined, there could be other artifacts and assets that get spun up during the creation of a team. So having role-based access controls or extending them from your existing environment is very important. That's just going to ensure that people will be able to see what they have permission to see, and that they won't be able to see the things they don't have permission for. There's also the ability to use public and private channels. So if you are, let's say you're working on a brand new top secret product for your manufacturing company, you wouldn't want to have one of your teams in the environment called Top Secret Project X. You would want that to be a private team that's just available to and just visible to the people who are members on that. You can also have public channels. There was a session, I missed it a little earlier today, about shared channels, Teams shared channels deep dive. So I've used those in a couple of cases where I've been working very closely with a customer who wanted me to appear as one of the customer team to interact with another third-party client. And a lot of the information sharing and collaboration that we did was on a shared channel. That worked really well in that case, and I imagine for a lot of companies who are doing heavy collaboration or internal, external collaboration, Teams shared channels are great. They're a great solution for that. I think before you might have to set up a SharePoint site and add external sharing and do, extra controls in Azure, and it was not a very seamless process. So this makes that process a little bit more easy, especially if there's some, RBAC and governance defined.
Is the behavior different in a shared channel? Because you can't, when you have an external user, then you can't attach files.
You can if they're a guest user, yeah. And let's see, yes, you can if you're a guest. If they're external, you can't share files. If they're a guest, you can. And that makes it easier for them too, because they don't have to sign out of their tenant. They'll just see, based on their login in their tenant, if they click on the user icon, they'll see the other tenants that they're a member of. So they could be external companies. And that gives them easy toggle access to that information. So the box at the bottom is just like a mile marker referring back to our circular, colorful graph. And then the corner at the top indicates typically where these things are managed. So if you're rolling out Teams, your security probably already exists. If you're already using SharePoint, if you already have people in Azure Active Directory, if you're already using Microsoft 365 groups or Office groups, and in the security is where roles and access controls can be shaped and defined. Our next one is data protection and compliance. This one can be a unicorn. Data means a lot of things. So you'll find in governance circles, sometimes people are very specific about saying data governance or information governance, because they can be managed differently. Data is information to a degree, but data is data in its purest form. Data with some knowledge around it and context built around it is information. So things like sensitivity labeling or data classification, all of those fall under data protection and compliance. The compliance piece here could be anything. So if you're in a regulated industry, you might have to adhere to HIPAA compliance, GDPR. In the US, there are a number of states that are enacting their own data privacy laws and legislation. I think there are 4 states right now that have protections in place for consumer data protection. Colorado has a data protection law that's going into effect in July this year, I think. A couple more states by the end of the year. So of course, all 50 of them are going to do it eventually, and they'll all be different. But, but there are mechanisms built that are going to be able to be adaptable and extensible to reflect those. Data retention and eDiscovery, that kind of falls into if you have a records management background or history, that's probably a sweet spot for records managers, being able to do that type of eDiscovery or data classification for things like legal holds, potentially, managing retention, and also therefore by default disposition. Whoops. That all happens in data protection and compliance, but where that really happens is in a lot of different places. So for data protections, like your data catalog, your data systems definitions, your data connectors, that type of governance is managed in Azure, Azure Data Services, I think. Do I have it on here? I don't. And then there's also a lot of features in Microsoft Purview. So data loss prevention, that is where the company, using its information governance policies, has defined what content is considered confidential, what type of content is considered sensitive, internal, or public, I think, or default. Of course, you can add some labels there as well. And to a large degree, once those are defined, they can be automated. In Outlook, sometimes you'll see some of that labeling by default. If you receive emails from other people, it might have those labels attached. Those labels can also are extensible. So one of the things I love about the Microsoft 365 stack from a SharePoint background is once upon a time, if you developed anything retention related, it was great for SharePoint, but it didn't apply to Exchange or email or OneDrive or MyDrive or file shares or anything else. So you were going to have to essentially recreate your requirements on every platform or every service. In the 365 ecosystem, that's extensible. You create your rule or your policy or your label once, and then you can define where that becomes deployed to. And then if you're using things like adaptive scopes, let's say for your environment or your architecture that has defined, hub and spoke sites, and a new spoke site, for example, gets built and connected to a hub, it will inherit the defined sensitivity labeling that's been associated with that hub without you having, or without an admin having to say, oh, we've got a new site, we better go do all the things to make governance happen for this site. That can happen automatically just by site tangent connection or site relationships. Okay, the next one is monitoring and reporting, and this sounds a little big brothery, but there are really some awesome reporting tools that are available. And there are a couple of places that you would get those. You might have heard or gone to an earlier presentation about Hack the Tech. That was about the Teams Admin Center. That's what the little corner identifier is. Most of these things are built in. There are a number, I want to say there are 20 or so built-in automatic reports for Teams reporting. It can focus on users or devices or abnormal behavior. And this is above and beyond what you might define in Purview. So for example, in Purview, you can define information barriers. Let's say if finance is not supposed to talk to HR. You can define communications compliance to kind of monitor for if people are trying to exfiltrate information that should be confidential and saved, not sent elsewhere or downloaded. You can also monitor, excuse me, you can also monitor activity for, let's say, abandoned sites or orphaned sites. It gives you a lot of that unified communications insight too. So if you are utilizing maybe a third-party platform manager and you have Oracle and your PBX systems and Teams and telephony and video monitoring, there's a lot of reporting that is fairly standardized or that you can enhance that's available out of the box. And those are just standard reports out of the Teams Admin Center. It's not necessarily where you'd think to go for that type of thing. My brain would want to go to the Purview section for audit and reporting and create, an audit trail there. This saves you from having to do that. You can still go into Purview and create different monitoring type or audit reports if some of these canned ones don't meet your needs. But that's just, another way to save your IT administration a little bit of time and effort. And then it's also a great way to spot, where you're seeing perhaps instances of shadow IT, other issues related to security or device usage, and all of that gives you some insight into reviewing and revising your governance policies. One of the things that I like to recommend for governance policies is that they have a review period. 3 years, I hear, is kind of standard, but with the rate of change recently and the explosion in the volume of data that's created, I think annually might be, maybe that's too aggressive, but I like to recommend annually. So if your organization has information governance or data governance policies or compliance policies, setting an automation or workflow around reviewing those policies, making sure that they're still adequate and accurate for the business that you're doing right now. I think if the pandemic taught us anything is that we all need to be able to pivot on a dime and, be agile and flexible to adapt maybe new business streams or different lines of business in the way that we operate. So having an annual review and verification of those policies, I think, is a good idea. and it gives you a little bit more control over your environment. So if there is some shadow IT or sprawl happening, it won't be 5 years gone by the time that you notice it. All right. Our next one is incident management and response. So as we mentioned, if there are issues with teams within your company or your environment, your users are going to let you know that. But if you have defined security, let's say you're using Azure Sentinel, or perhaps your company is required to deploy zero trust security policies, those are a bit more robust. Azure Sentinel I'm not trying to sell Azure Sentinel, but Azure Sentinel is a great utility for that. It inherently monitors all of its Microsoft environment, but the extensibility comes into play there too. So it can help kind of safeguard bad actor, bad behavior, bad attachments and that sort of thing. That's largely, though, that typically would be managed by your security team or your IT management team, and those activities can happen, if they're utilizing throwable microphone. Sorry, if they're utilizing Sentinel or other monitoring and reporting apps, then they can extend that monitoring over into the team's environment for incident management. A lot of the Microsoft Security Panel has a lot of automated alerting and incident tracking and management that can be turned on or activated and auto-generate notifications or auto-prioritize things based on criteria that you define. So, just being proactive in managing the security and the requirements around your environment is a good idea. Although a lot of people don't really think of incident management as a governance component. I like to include it. And then our last one, training and awareness. So, it's very important to roll things out or to communicate to people before rolling things out, because there's always going to be that guy or that girl, I'm guilty of that, who is like, hey, what is this new thing? I'm seeing this new icon in my waffle. I want to try that out. What's it doing? I need to know those things. Even if it's going to be an announcement or an email that I might miss, I appreciate kind of having that flow of transparency or information. I think it's also a great opportunity to normalize conversations around governance or compliance with your company, with your employees and your colleagues. Oftentimes, Tiffany and I just had a little impromptu podcast out in the podcast booth about governance and how it's often considered like a 4-letter word, or the boundary of no, or what else? Negative connotations, right? All the way around. People think it's a pain, it interrupts the flow of work, it kills productivity. Not if it's done right. If it's predefined, if it's automated, if it's built in, it can be fairly seamless for end users. But normalizing communications about governance, what your company does around governance and compliance, and what it considers, what the rules of the road are for you as an employee. In addition to
back to your values as a company, right? I mean,
Yep.
making it part of that mission statement, that governance answers to our mission.
That's a good point. So there's a whole other field of governance around boards of directors and that type of governance for companies. I think that's where that plays in a bunch. I run a nonprofit entity, and we have a pretty robust action log, and it's an Excel spreadsheet with a lot of drop downs. But if somebody throws an idea on there, that person is tasked with choosing, which mission objective this will support, or which educational outreach objective this new idea will support. And if it doesn't, then they can leave those fields blank. But it gives the management team an opportunity to say, if we're suggesting a lot of things that don't tie into our mission and values, maybe we need to update our mission and values. Or, if not, then maybe we got them right the first time. But these things are evergreen. They need to be reviewed and revised and adapt over time. But normalizing that word, governance, our company utilizes governance, we manage our environment in a certain way. I worked with an organization recently who had this fantastic onboarding slide deck. It was fairly baked in, you couldn't skip ahead. You had to read through the things and click things. But it was really well done, introducing the concept of governance as though you're a new employee and what that means for a company. Yes? Yes, so he said governance is very important on the front end. I could not agree more. Going back to that toothpaste in a tube analogy, it's so much harder to try and retrofit something. I worked with one organization for their digital transformation, and I brought the voice of governance into that planning process. I've also done some cloud transformation, so have that experience, but I was bringing the voice of governance in terms of how are you going to have, how do your employees request a new team? Do they just click the button, or are you going to have a request process? Do you have naming conventions? If you have naming conventions, are they going to align with what you've already stated in your information policies?
Are you going to train them on how to customize their notification so that they don't complain about how many notifications they get?
Exactly.
All of that governance needs to come from not IT. It comes from
Yes.
head of HR, from finance, from here,
Like
from
them.
here, because
Yeah.
it's their rules that have to apply to their employees.
Excellent.
IT comes in and says, we're going to do this, they're going to miss what finance needs, what.
Well, I mean, she said this already. That's the importance of the governance council, right?
Yep.
It's gonna have all of that input from
All
all
of
of
this
those
council
different
has to
businesses.
be everybody.
That's a
All
best
IT 's
practice.
doing- Yeah, all IT is doing is configuring the dials the way
Yep.
they were told.
So,
But also, I would add, providing the training to legal, to HR, to finance.
yes.
Hey, here are the options. How do you want this configured?
Oh,
Because
that's
we don't really want IT making these calls.
that's a great idea.
But a lot of the times, they actually don't know, so they need guidance.
Yes,
They actually don't know what they should do in terms of service.
that's true.
I'm trying to push forward, like onboarding an employee. One of them is the IT policies, what they can and can't do, and email policies as well, what they can and can't do, in terms of how they appear to externals, right?
Mhm.
What language they can use, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just a very symbiotic sort of relationship.
Absolutely. So I'm going to summarize some of what was said out here for the mic, for the feed. And essentially, governance needs to be defined at the front end. You should have stakeholders from each department or line of business or business function, because those are the people who are going to be most fluent with that data and what the requirements are for that data in their day-to-day use. Having those people come together to define the compliance and governance requirements is excellent. IT is often going to be the implementer of those definitions. So rather than asking business stakeholders, hey, what would you like to do with compliance? I always find that giving them options is a really good idea. So knowing the product first, and understanding what you can do out of the box, or if you have additional management layers built in, give each business unit a few options. Well, we can define this, and we can shape this, and we can build a workflow, and give them a menu to choose from, and then further define out what their requirements are. IT implements, then it goes into kind of a monitoring and review. That's the ideal
And put
world.
them in charge of monitoring, not IT. Yeah. Right? Make them, here's the
Good.
reports you have available to you. You're going to monitor this. You're going to look at them every year.
Excellent.
Yeah, we require the compliance team to pull like the eDiscovery. IT does not do it. We completely stay out of it.
That's
And
great.
I would be cautious with alerting too, because if you're alerting and doing nothing with it, then what are you doing?
Right.
Right. And what I was going to say is, like you were saying before, it's a living, breathing, I would say even more than once a year. The roadmap is rolling out features as we speak. So
Yes.
as those features come, governance
That's a great point.
That and business changes constantly throughout the year.
Mm. So technology changes and business changes and regulations changing are all going to require kind of an evergreen approach to managing governance. Having the business stakeholders be responsible for doing the reviews of those governance rules and requirements is ideal. Sometimes, yeah, I think we've mentioned a couple of times a steering committee or a governance committee or a compliance team. Small and medium businesses often don't have those functions. So typically a CEO or a CIO ends up kind of encompassing that. And oftentimes in small and medium businesses, there is not really much proactive governance at all until there's a problem, right? Unless it's a heavily regulated industry and they know that going in. But a lot of small businesses are not necessarily going to, throw zero trust like parameters around their security modeling, for example, until there's a problem. And then to users within that company, it feels like the prison walls go up instantly, right? Oh, now I can't share this there and do that. It's better to build it in naturally so it's always part of the environment from day one. Yeah. Oftentimes I find that I used to hate doing this, but developing user stories or use cases is very effective. So use a situation within your company. Okay, well, let's say James, or even better if it's a real example. Remember last quarter when James sent that earnings report out to so-and-so and it wasn't finished yet and we didn't have sensitivity labeling on it, went externally, somebody reported on us. There are a lot of good use cases that you can either theorize or use ChatGPT to help you write to help drive management approval. Yes?
Yeah, I would add that, one part of the conversation needs to be whose data is it, right? Remind the people it's not your personal data, it's this company.
Right. He reminded us about data ownership. That all belongs to the company.
But you got to find a balance between making it, what the company needs and making it usable for the users.
Yes.
Let's all agree, I think, that if you make it too hard, you're making a breeding ground for shadow IT.
Exactly.
Yeah, I always say, users will find a way.
Yeah.
I actually had, it happened to me yesterday, I had to explain to external VIP why we only gave view-only access for a directory. We were trying to work out how to spin this so the data would get upset. And so that's simple. I said they can't download 2 gigs of data because one, that data is constantly being updated every day. And with view-only, non-downloadable, web access only,
Mm.
we are ensuring the integrity of the data as opposed to the people like, oh, this SharePoint shit is like hardware. Just put it on Dropbox and I'll be able to download it. It's like, oh, then there's a breakage
Yeah.
refreshing the data.
So he mentioned that, in rapidly changing data environments, requiring users to access it via web only and preventing downloads so they always get the most accurate version is a good control. So in the little corners of each of the slides before, I tried to reference where the particular management functions for each of those governance components lives. Of course, with Microsoft, sometimes you can do the same thing through multiple avenues. So this doesn't necessarily reflect that. But Teams admin control, or TAC, is where your gold mine of default and canned monitoring reporting exists. It's also where you can do your centralized Teams management. Maybe you don't want to roll out to new teams, or maybe you're not in public preview yet. Maybe you want to wait to roll out mesh avatars until a specific event in the company. You have the ability to kind of manage some of that there. And then for administrative services or compliance management, there's a bucket load of things that you can do in Microsoft Purview that, so Purview, interesting story, you might already know this, but Azure Purview was a thing. And if you look at the blue column, the Azure management around data and data protection and data connection integrity and data, service roles and definitions and mapping and stewardship, that was already kind of a thing in Azure because that's kind of where the data lives. And Purview is a great term for that. Now, if you scan back a few years and think about the Admin Center in Microsoft 365, it used to be called Security and Compliance. And there has been a little bit of a sea change of new personnel in Microsoft who have helped the compliance piece of that go from sort of okay to suddenly very robust. I would say like within 2-3 years. Would you agree? There are new features, and it seems like new features every week that are rolling out with some of the granularity of controls that you can do around retention management and preservation holds and records management. So it made sense for Microsoft at that time, since that's data protection and then there's this information protection, let's blend it all together and call it Purview. Also for that extensibility piece. So, before you could manage your compliance on SharePoint or Exchange or OneDrive, and you couldn't extend it to Teams yet for a while. But with the Azure Purview component, that could be externally extensible in some cases. So having that all kind of come under the same umbrella to reflect your data and information protection, I think is a good thing. But all of those things, data, information barriers, data loss prevention, data policies, retention policies, audit logs, so that is a little bit different from the Teams usage monitoring and reporting, but if you see a behavior that is perhaps not what you're expecting to see within a company, you can create an audit log to track and see if it's a repeating behavior and manage things better, a little better that way. So with that, feel free, I didn't realize until today there were feedback stars in the Just Attend app, so feel free to use that. But if you would like to give a little bit more in-depth feedback on my session today, I would greatly appreciate it, even if it is negative and or constructive feedback. That's where you grow, I think. You don't grow if people say, oh, great, okay. So let me have it. And, oh, I'm not done yet. There's one more slide. We have a pop quiz. All right. So bear with me. I have taken a page from Richard's handbook. Richard in the back, who did the presentation with, drawn a blank, Eric, earlier today around ChatGPT and AI. So we have a Cahoots. Let's see, let me do it. Control-Shift-Mod, and I need to exit my PowerPoint. Let's see, that and that. And can I just move that over there? No, I'm going to have to change how I do my display. Bear with me for just a second. We have 11 minutes. Okay. System, display. I appreciate your patience. Okay, duplicate. There. I'm going to close that. All right. So we'll have a little pop quiz by Cahoots. Let me launch it real quick. If you already have the app, go ahead and use that. If you don't, it is Kahoot, KAHOOT.IT, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. It's kind of an instant download of an interactive quiz app. All right. So I think I've got 4 questions. You'll have 20 seconds per question to select the correct choice. They're multiple choice and true and false. When you have the Kahoot app, just type in the PIN number. It's 1313303 to land on the quiz page. And let's see. Show of hands of anybody who's not connected yet. Okay, I'll wait. Oh, okay. Oh. Oh. There you go. You know, a lot of, yes?
Was it difficult for you to create your own?
No, in fact, I did it in like 15 minutes. Yes. Okay. Are we ready?
We're ready.
Is it? Excellent. Okay. Oh, great. Good to know. All right. So with that, I am going to hit start. Okay. Our first pop quiz question. What flavor service is Microsoft Teams? Platform as a service, software as a service, IT as a service, or infrastructure as a service? And the faster that you answer, the more points you collect. All right. Excellent. Okey-doke. Preston's in the lead. Awesome. We have an excellent prize for whoever wins this. All right, next question is, which of these is not a key component of governance? So thinking about back to that colorful circle chart, right? Policies and guidelines, data protection, individually defined, monitoring and reporting, internet management, or training and awareness. Awesome. Yes, individually, we don't want people defining their own governance. So let's let the company do that. Okay, so our next scorecard is, yay, Tiffany's in the lead.
Aha. Come at me, bros. Come at me.
Okay, third question is a true or false. You can extend retention policies to Teams and chats. And I don't think we're even going to need the whole 20 seconds for this. I think everybody's already answered. Excellent. That is true. All right. Chats are retainable. They are saved in OneDrive for the users participating. All right, our final question. Oh, scorecard adjustment. Tiffany's still at the top.
Got this.
I swear I didn't go over any of these questions with her. Okay, which of these is not an area where you can manage a team's governance features? Viva Connections, Azure, Purview, or TAC, the Teams Admin Center? Dun, dun. Viva Connections is correct. Although that may change, who knows? So, all right. What's that? Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Preston, LR are second and third place winners, and number one is Tiffany. Thanks so much for playing. Here is your lovely prize.
Okay, but I'm going to give one to Preston and one to LR.
Okay, it's churros.
Most common gift.
Yes.
Who's Preston and who's LR? Yeah?
Excellent.
Churro. Where's Preston?
All right.